I have given this testimony 4 times, twice before the Compact Tribunal, once before the Joint Council's Committee on Proportionality, once before the Secretary General's closed commission, in a room with no windows and a recording device that one of the attending staff switched off when they thought I wasn't watching. I let them switch it off. The record that matters is not on any device in that room. The record that matters is on the surface of Volkai Prime, where I left it on the 19th day, and it will still be there long after every person in that windowless room has turned to dust. I will give this testimony a 5th time now, in my own words, in the order that it happened, without omission and without apology. If it costs me the rank, I will wear the verdict without complaint. I have worn heavier things. My name is Corin Veth. I held the rank of Fleet Admiral Terran Consolidated Forces at the time of the events described herein. I commanded the Ardent Spire 380 warships, 7 ground assault divisions, and a support train of 64 vessels, from the bridge of the dreadnought Irrevocable Promise. The operation lasted 19 days. I am the senior officer of record. Everything that follows is mine. I want to begin not with the operation but with the 14 worlds, because if I begin with the fleet and the fire and the 19 days, then I have already let the Volkai frame the story, and the Volkai have had enough of their framing. Let me give the 14 worlds their right names, and let me give them that before anything else, because they are the reason the Ardent Spire exists, and they are the reason I can stand here and say what I am about to say and mean every syllable of it. Cavendish's Reach, Ellery Station, New Mabunda, Portsmouth Colony, the terraced worlds of Cansavari, 3 of them, Cansavari Alpha, Beta, and Meridian, counted separately because they were settled separately and they died separately. Old Galveston, the Ferris Belt habitats, 4 stations linked by a common atmospheric dome, counted as one world because they shared one sky and that sky was taken from them together. Haverson's World, Tura Selan, Mita's Reach. 14 worlds. 41,207,914 people. By the final census compiled by the Office of Colonial Affairs, and verified 3 times over a period of 8 months after the consecration concluded. That number does not include the 6,411 people who died in the evacuation transit, because the compact monitors did not classify evacuation transit deaths as consecration deaths, and I have chosen for the purposes of this testimony not to argue classifications. 41,207,914. Let that be the number we use. I want to dwell on the nature of the dying, because I think that detail has been smoothed over in most of the secondary accounts that have circulated since the operation concluded. The atmospheric cedar drones worked by introducing a cascade compound into the upper atmosphere of each target world, a compound the Volkai called, in the theological documentation we recovered from the Peleth command installation, the breath of the shaping voice. The compound was not immediately lethal. It was, in fact, a slow process. The compound altered the atmospheric chemistry in a way that reduced oxygen equivalent availability by approximately 4% per week. For the first 2 weeks, the effect was subclinical, headaches, mild fatigue, reduced exercise tolerance. Compact monitors, reviewing atmospheric data, noted anomalies and filed routine inquiries that were answered by the Volkai survey and census instrument classification. Colonial medical authorities logged an uptick in respiratory complaints and attributed them, in most cases, to seasonal variation or stress. By week 4, the colony hospitals were beginning to fill. By week 5, the elderly were dying first, and then the very young, and then the people with existing respiratory conditions. By week 6, the healthy adults were dying too, slowly and with full awareness of what was happening to them and full inability to do anything about it. Because the compound was in the upper atmosphere, and the colonies did not have the equipment to address upper atmosphere contamination on the scale that had been introduced, and the evacuation ships that were dispatched when the crisis was finally classified as a crisis were not enough, and were not fast enough and could not carry enough people. I know the nature of the dying because I read the medical after-action reports. I know the dying because a woman named Dr. Avala Fenn, the chief medical officer of Haverson's World's primary hospital, kept a log for 31 days from the first clinical deaths to the moment she was evacuated, and that log was recovered from her personal data device and submitted to the Office of Colonial Affairs. And the Office of Colonial Affairs sent me a copy because I had asked to see every primary document they had. I read Dr. Fenn's log in a single sitting, over approximately 4 hours, in my office on the irrevocable promise on the 6th day after we departed Tyranny's Deep. I did not read it for operational purposes. I read it because I thought it was owed, that someone who had the authority to do what I was about to do should also be willing to sit with the full weight of why they were doing it, in the clearest form available. Dr. Fenn was a precise writer. She did not editorialize much. She recorded who came in, what their presentation was, what was done for them, and what happened. The entries in the final 12 days of the log are shorter than the earlier ones. I think this is because she had less time, not because she had less to say. The last entry reads, 31 confirmed deaths today. We have moved from palliative to hospice protocols. The compound saturation is past the reversal threshold. The evacuation priority list has been finalized. I have not put my own name on it. She was evacuated despite this. The evacuating captain found the list and added her name to it. She survived. She has testified before the compact tribunal herself. I have read her testimony. It is also precise. She does not editorialize. I carry Dr. Fenn's name alongside the 41,207,914. She is not one of the dead, but she is one of the indelible. They are different categories and both matter. Each of those worlds had an atmosphere seeded by Volkai ascendancy drones over a period that began, depending on the world, between 52 and 61 days before the first recorded death. The drones were classified by compact monitoring stations as survey and census instruments, Class 4, a designation that had historically applied to the long-range atmospheric analysis, probes the Volkai used to assess planetary habitability when evaluating new territory for their own expansion. The classification was made at the monitoring station level. It was not escalated. The chief monitor for the outer compact territories, a Yelvathi named Assessor Brone Quellen, signed off on the Class 4 designation for all 14 worlds drone deployments within a span of 11 days. He did this without convening an advisory board. He did this, the subsequent inquiry found, correctly according to the existing classification criteria. Because the existing classification criteria had not been updated in 37 years, and had never contemplated the possibility that a species with Class 4 instrumentation might be using it to kill. I want to be precise about this, because in several of my previous testimonies, the compact has attempted to position my response, our response, as a reaction to a tragedy that was, in part, the result of a monitoring failure. They have attempted, with varying degrees of subtlety, to share the moral weight of the consecration across multiple parties. The Volkai, who deployed the drones, compact monitoring, who misclassified them, and by implication the colonial authorities on each world, who did not raise sufficient alarm at the presence of atmospheric survey instruments in their orbit, because nobody in 40 years had ever been given a reason to. I do not share that framing. I want the record to be unambiguous on this point before I describe a single day of the operation. The moral weight of what happened on those 14 worlds belongs entirely and without distribution to the Volkai ascendancy. They built the drones. They seeded the atmospheres. They filed a doctrinal brief with the Compact Council, 11 days after the last of the 14 worlds' atmospheric collapse was complete, stating that the Unformed, their term, their word from the Volkai theological canon, applied to any species that had not undergone the ascendancy's rite of consecration. Do not breathe sacred air. The doctrine holds that the air of the galaxy is a gift of the Volokai's primary deity, a being they call the shaping voice, and that to allow the unformed to breathe it unreformed is a desecration. The consecration of the 14 worlds was not an accident, not a weapons test, not a miscommunication. It was a sacrament. They wrote that in the brief, with a theological citation and a statement of intent going forward regarding the compact's remaining unconsecrated territories. The Compact Council received the brief. They entered it into the record. They tabled it pending review by the Committee on Interspecies Theological Conflict Resolution, which was a body that had met 4 times in the previous decade and had no enforcement mechanism and no authority to do anything except produce recommendations. Earth's representative, Ambassador Daleen Urch, delivered a formal protest, specific, documented, with the census numbers attached, and requested emergency authorization for a proportionate response. The emergency authorization request was tabled alongside the doctrinal brief. The Committee on Proportionality was asked to convene within 90 days. I received my orders 6 days after the brief was filed. I want to be careful here about the nature of those orders, because several people in several rooms have implied, with varying degrees of directness, that I operated outside them. I did not operate outside them. My orders, signed by the Joint Council and countersigned by the Secretary General, authorized the Ardent Spire to address all Volokai Ascendancy military and infrastructural assets across their sovereign territory. The language "all military and infrastructural assets" was not an accident of drafting. The Joint Council's legal team spent 61 hours on that language. I have read the deliberation minutes. They knew what they were authorizing. They authorized it with full knowledge of what the Volokai had done, and full knowledge of what a fleet of 380 warships with 7 ground divisions would constitute as an answer. They chose the answer. I executed it. That is the correct division of responsibility, and I refuse to let subsequent discomfort blur it. The Ardent Spire assembled at the Tyranny's deep staging area over a period of 22 days. By the time we departed, every commanding officer aboard every vessel in the fleet had been briefed on the consecration, not with statistics on a slide, with names. Each officer received a printed document, 43 pages, which listed the verified dead of each of the 14 worlds by name, age, and world of origin. I required them to read it before the fleet moved. I required them to sign a receipt confirming that they had read it. I kept the receipts. I am sometimes asked why I did that. The answer is simple. I did not want anyone in the Ardent Spire to be able to say, afterward, that they had not known what we were avenging. I did not want the operation to feel, to anyone who participated in it, like a military exercise or a political instrument or a career-defining command. I wanted every person aboard those 380 ships to know that we were going to the Volokai Ascendancy because 41,207,914 people had died breathing, which is the most ordinary thing a living being does, which is the thing that happens before you can do anything else, and that the universe had decided, in its incomprehensible indifference, to let that happen, and we had decided that we were not going to be the universe. We were going to be something else. I also required on the day before departure that every ship in the fleet perform a synchronized 60-second silence. All hands, all stations. No exceptions for operational necessity. I had timed the silence for the lowest activity window in the ship day. I have been told this was unusual for a fleet of that size. I accept that characterization. I believe it was necessary. Silence of that kind, shared across that many people, is not ceremony for its own sake. It is acknowledgement. It is the moment in which a community of soldiers agrees together on what they are carrying and why before they lift it. I wanted the Ardent Spire to be a weight and to know itself as a weight, and the silence was how I made that happen. We departed Tyranny's Deep on the 8th day of the 3rd month. Transit time to the Volkai outer boundary was 11 days through conventional drive corridors. We did not use stealth. I ordered the fleet to run full identification beacons for the entire transit. I wanted the Volkai to see us coming. I wanted them to have time to think about what they had done. On the 3rd day of transit, we received a communication from the Volkai Ascendancy's Theological Council, not their military command, not their diplomatic corps, but their Theological Council, which was either an indication of how completely they had convinced themselves this was a religious matter rather than a political one, or an indication that they believed we would respond to theology. The communication was addressed to Fleet Admiral Corin Veth, carrier of the Unformed Wrath, a designation they had apparently assigned me that I was not consulted about, and it stated that the Ardent Spire's approach was an act of desecration against the shaping voice, that the Unformed's grief, while acknowledged, did not constitute a valid theological claim against the Ascendancy's right to prepare the galaxy for consecration, and that if the fleet withdrew within 48 hours, the Theological Council would consider opening a dialogue about the Compact's petition. I did not respond to it. My communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Hesse Drow, asked if I wanted a response drafted. I told her the reply was the fleet, and that it was already in transit, and that this was all the dialogue we intended to offer. On the 7th day of transit, the Volkai Military Command made contact, different channel, different tone. A Volkai fleet prelate named Sorvin Kelth, which was a rank that combined military command with theological authority in the way that the Volkai structures did, announced that the Ascendancy had mobilized its defense forces, and that any incursion into Ascendancy sovereign space would be met with the full weight of consecrated arms. He used the phrase consecrated arms twice. I noticed both times that he did not mention numbers. I made a note of it. Our intelligence assessment of the Volkai military capability had been prepared over 4 months by the Consolidated Forces Strategic Analysis Division. The Volkai were not a small civilization. They administered 22 sanctuary worlds and a significant belt of resource extraction installations, but their military had not fought a peer engagement in over 2 centuries. Their defense forces were built around patrol capability and internal security. They had a tradition of theological deterrence, the belief, apparently well-founded in their experience with the smaller species of their region, that invoking the wrath of the shaping voice was sufficient to discourage interference. They had never encountered a species that did not know what the shaping voice was, and had never been given a reason to consider what might happen if one came at them anyway. On the 8th day of transit, I made my rounds of the fleet by shuttle, a practice I have maintained since my first independent command, which my first commanding officer called walking the line, and which I have never found a better name for. I visited 7 ships over the course of 14 hours. I talked to engineers and weapons crews and medics and bridge officers. I ate in 3 different mess halls. I did not give speeches. I have never found Fleet Admiral speeches to be useful for much of anything, except reminding people that there is a Fleet Admiral aboard, which they already know. What I found, walking the line on day 8, was something I had not encountered in quite this form before, and I want to try to describe it accurately because I think it is relevant to understanding what the Ardent Spire was and how it did what it did. What I found was a particular quality of quiet. Not the quiet of fear, which I know well and which has a specific texture, a tightness in posture, an avoidance of eye contact, conversations that stop when the senior officer enters. Not the quiet of boredom, which is a different thing altogether. What I found was the quiet of people who had read 43 pages and signed a receipt and had 11 days of transit in which to carry what they had read, and had decided, somewhere in those 11 days, how to carry it. It was a quiet that had weight in it, a quiet that was doing work. I have commanded forces going into combat several times in my career. I have seen the standard emotional arc of a fleet moving toward a fight. The first days of energy, the middle days of impatience and gallows humor, the final days of focused anxiety and professional tightening. The Ardent Spire on day 8 was not in that arc. The Ardent Spire on day 8 was somewhere else, somewhere that didn't have a name in the standard frameworks, because the standard frameworks don't fully account for a force that isn't going to a fight so much as going to the completion of something that was started on 14 worlds by someone else. There is a difference. I felt it in every mess hall I sat in, and every engine room I walked through. On the 9th day of transit, I went down to the main cargo hold of the Irrevocable Promise at 300 hours, when the ship was quiet. I do not make a habit of explaining my movements to my staff, and I have not explained this one before. I went because the hold was where we were carrying, in climate-controlled storage containers, the 14 atmospheric samples, one per world, taken from each colony's upper atmosphere by drone before the compound reached full saturation, so that we would have a physical record of what the air had been before the Volkai altered it. The samples were not operationally necessary. I had ordered them collected because it seemed to me that the specific thing the Volkai had taken should be physically present, somewhere in the fleet, as a fact rather than a statistic. I stood in the cargo hold for perhaps 20 minutes. The storage containers were sealed, obviously. There was no atmosphere to smell, no air to sample, just metal containers in a cold room. But I stood there anyway, because there are things a commander cannot afford to leave entirely abstract, and the air of 14 worlds was not abstract to me, even in sealed containers, even in a cargo hold at 300. I thought about the specific composition of the air of Cavendish's Reach, which I had read in the atmospheric survey report, an oxygen-nitrogen mix with a slightly elevated helium fraction that gave it, in field accounts, a mild lift in high-exertion scenarios, which the colonists who had lived there for 3 generations knew and accounted for and never thought about particularly, the way people don't think about the air unless something changes it. I thought about that. I thought about the 41 million breathing that air, and the 217,000 others breathing 17 different versions of it across the other 13 worlds, all of them going about the ordinary life that ordinary air supports, until the drones arrived and began their 6-week work. Sometimes a commander's job is to stand in the cold room and think about what is in the containers, so that the part of the command that executes orders does not become entirely separate from the part that knows why. I have found, over 31 years in service, that keeping those parts connected is harder than most of the operational problems I have been given to solve, and more important than most of them too. We reached the Volkai outer boundary at 400 hours, ship time, on the 19th day of departure from Tyranny's Deep. There were no ships waiting at the boundary. There were no weapons platforms, no interdiction fields, no automated defense grids. What there was, broadcasting on every frequency the Volkai used, was a theological invocation, a recorded prayer, looping, addressed to the shaping voice, asking for the sanctification of the boundary and the destruction of the unformed who approached it. I listened to 12 seconds of it before muting the channel. I gave the order to cross the boundary at 4:07 hours. All 380 ships crossed together in formation at standard cruising speed. I did not order anything dramatic. I did not order a charge. I ordered the fleet to proceed at the pace of deliberate work, because that is what we were there to do. The Volkai had distributed their defense assets across 8 of their 22 sanctuary worlds and 6 of their orbital installation clusters. The distribution made strategic sense if you assumed an attacker would probe the outer worlds first and negotiate if initial engagements were costly enough. It made no sense at all against an attacker who had no interest in probing and no interest in negotiations. We had planned accordingly. The Ardent Spire split into 6 action groups on day 1 inside Volkai space. The operation proceeded according to plan, with a variance of less than 4% across all 19 days. The Volkai Defense Forces engaged us at every point where they were positioned to do so. They fought, in most cases, with genuine conviction. I have noted in my personal log that the Volkai military died the way religious soldiers often die, believing absolutely that they were right, that the universe would validate their righteousness, that the mathematics of the situation would somehow resolve in favor of doctrine. It did not. Mathematics does not consult doctrine. I will describe 3 moments from the 19 days, because I think they are relevant to the questions that have been put to me in previous testimonies, and that will be put to me again. The first moment occurred on day 4, at Volkai Savan, the third sanctuary world, a terrestrial planet of moderate size with a population that our intelligence placed at approximately 600,000, the majority of them civilian. Savan hosted one of the 8 distributed defense clusters and a significant installation that served as both a theological seminary and a command center for the southern approach corridor. My orders covering Volkai Savan were to address the defense cluster and the command installation. The civilian population of Savan was not a target. It was not a target in any document I signed, any briefing I gave, any order I issued to any subordinate commander. The civilian population of Volkai Savan was not a target, and nothing done at Volkai Savan harmed any civilian, because I was very careful that it would not, and because the officers commanding the action group assigned to Savan were professionals who understood the difference between a military installation and a planet. I describe this not because it is remarkable. It is what any officer operating within the laws of armed conflict does, or is supposed to do, but because, in one of my previous testimonies, a member of the Compact Tribunal asked me, with what I thought was genuine curiosity, whether I had felt any compunction about the civilians of the Volkai Ascendancy. I told him I had. I told him that the civilians of the Volkai Ascendancy did not deploy the Cedar drones. They did not file the doctrinal brief. They did not, so far as I knew, vote on the consecration in any meaningful democratic sense, because the Volkai Ascendancy is a theological oligarchy in which the hierarchs hold doctrinal authority, and the civilian population holds very little power over anything the hierarchs decide. And so I protected them, as military law requires and as my own conscience requires, and I destroyed what was mine to destroy. He seemed surprised by this answer. I was not surprised by his surprise. The second moment occurred on day 9, at Volkai Pelath, the 6th sanctuary world and the seat of the Ascendancy's primary military command. Pelath was the hardest engagement of the 19 days. The Volkai had concentrated their most capable assets there, presumably because their military analysts had recognized by day 9 that the distribution strategy was failing, and that consolidation at the command center was the only remaining option that made doctrinal sense. They had perhaps 300 warships in position around Pelath when Action Group 2 arrived, and they used all of them. The engagement lasted 11 hours. We lost 14 ships. A ground assault lander carrying 217 personnel was destroyed during the atmospheric descent, when a surviving Volkai point defense battery achieved a direct hit before the battery's position was located and addressed. 409 Terran personnel died in the Pelath engagement. Their names are in the operational record. I know them. I want to describe the 11 hours at Pelath more fully than I have in previous testimonies, because I think the difficulty of the engagement is relevant to the question of what the operation was and what it was not. It was not a massacre of a helpless enemy. The Volkai at Pelath chose their ground and fought on it with everything they had available. I lost 14 ships and 409 people over 11 hours of sustained engagement. The cost was real. Anyone who characterizes the 19 days as a one-sided exercise in overwhelming force is ignoring Pelath. And I will not ignore Pelath, because the 409 dead of that engagement deserve their full weight in the account, the same way the 41 million deserve theirs. What made Peleth survivable for my fleet was not technological superiority alone. Our systems were better, but not so overwhelmingly better that a 300-ship defense mounted by a committed enemy could be discounted. What made Peleth survivable was preparation. My action group commanders had spent 80 days in simulation before departure, running the Peleth scenario in 47 different variants based on the intelligence assessment. They had run it until failure modes were exhausted and contingencies were reflexive. When the engagement unfolded in a configuration our simulations had not precisely anticipated, the Volkai had held a reserve force in close orbit around Peleth's second moon, masked by the moon's electromagnetic profile, and committed it in the 6th hour. My action group commander, Vice Admiral Lyris Tane, had already wargamed a similar reserve commitment scenario, and her response was in execution within 8 minutes of the reserve's emergence. 8 minutes. In an 11-hour engagement, that is a very small window, and it was filled by preparation. I tell this story about preparation because I want to be clear about something. The Ardent Spire was not an act of rage. Rage does not spend 80 days in simulation. Rage does not model 47 scenario variants. Rage does not carry atmospheric samples in climate-controlled containers or require officers to sign receipts for 43-page documents. What we did was organized and deliberate and planned by people who had absorbed the full weight of why it needed to be done, and had then spent months ensuring that it would be done correctly. That is not rage. I am not certain what word fits it better, but it is not rage, and I reject that characterization every time it is offered. When the Peleth defense was addressed, and the command installations on the planet's surface had been reached by the ground divisions, the surviving senior Volkai officer, a prelate marshal named Tethon Varus, who had commanded the Peleth defense from a bunker beneath the main seminary, sent a transmission requesting terms. He asked for a ceasefire pending negotiation. He asked for the Theological Council to be allowed to submit a formal petition. He asked, and I want to quote this precisely because I have it in the record and I think precision matters, that the Unformed's grief be weighed against the Ascendancy's sacred mandate, that both parties might find the place where justice and doctrine are reconciled. I dictated my response to Lieutenant Commander Drow, and she transmitted it within 4 minutes of receiving the request. My response was this: the terms expired on the day the first colony atmosphere collapsed. The Ardent Spire will continue its work. There will be no further communication on this channel. I have been asked multiple times whether this constituted a refusal of a lawful request for ceasefire negotiation. I have given the same answer each time. A party that fires a weapon does not acquire the right to stop the return fire by offering, after the return fire has begun, to discuss whether the weapon should have been fired. The Volkai Ascendancy was given, by the Compact's own process, a period of approximately 15 days between the filing of their doctrinal brief and the departure of the Ardent Spire from Tyranny's Deep. During those 15 days, the Compact Tribunal Committee met once and issued a procedural ruling about documentation requirements. Nobody from the Volkai Ascendancy used those 15 days to retract the brief, to disavow the consecration, or to offer anything that resembled acknowledgement. Prelate Marshal Tethon Varus was not in a position, from a bunker on Peleth on day 9, to offer me something the Theological Council had declined to offer while 41 million people still had air to breathe. The terms were what I said they were. They had expired. On day 14, after Volkai Peleth and the 11 worlds that had been addressed before it, I received a personal transmission from Secretary-General Habermas. The transmission was sent on a secure command channel and was not logged in the operational record by standing protocol. Personal transmissions from the Secretary-General to a fleet admiral in command are not operational communications and are not subject to the same logging requirements. I am including it in this testimony because I believe the Compact Tribunal has a right to know that it occurred, and because I have no interest in protecting myself at the cost of an incomplete record. The Secretary General told me he had been hearing from several compact member species delegations about the scale of the operation and the pace of its execution. He told me there was significant concern within the Compact Council about what a complete prosecution of the authorized scope would mean for the Compact's role as a mediating body in interspecies conflict. He told me he was not ordering me to stop. His authority does not extend to countermanding a joint council authorization once an operation is underway, but that he wanted me to know that the political environment was complicated and that he hoped I would exercise appropriate judgment in the remaining days. I replied, also on the secure channel, also not in the operational record. I am exercising appropriate judgment, Secretary General. Appropriate judgment is why we are still here. I did not hear from him again during the operation. I reflect on that exchange sometimes, particularly when I am in rooms like this one, and I think about what the Secretary General meant by appropriate judgment. I think he meant, stop before the end. Take something less than the full authorized scope. Give the Compact the ability to say it was not a complete 19-day prosecution. Give the political environment room to breathe. I thought about Cavendish's reach. I thought about Haverson's world and Dr. Avala Finn's log, and the 31 confirmed deaths she recorded in her last full entry before the evacuation. I thought about the 6,411 people who died in transit afterward, who are not counted in the 41 million because the Compact does not classify their deaths as consecration deaths, though I would argue with some passion that the distinction is a bookkeeping convenience and not a moral fact. I continued the operation. The days between Peleth and Volkai Prime, days 10 through 18, were, in operational terms, more methodical than dramatic. The remaining sanctuary worlds and installation clusters fell in the sequence we had planned. The Volkai resistance after Peleth was uneven. Some locations fought with the same conviction as the forces at Peleth. Others had dispersed their personnel before our arrival, and a small number transmitted early notifications of non-resistance. Non-resistance changed nothing about the addressing of the installations themselves, which were military and infrastructural targets regardless of whether personnel were present to defend them. But it changed the nature of the engagement, and I note it in the record because I want the record to be accurate about what we found rather than what anyone might prefer to imagine. There is one incident from the days between Peleth and Volkai Prime that I have not described in previous testimonies, and that I want to describe now, because it has been on my mind with some frequency, and because I think it belongs in a complete account. On day 16, the ground division assigned to the 7th Sanctuary World, Volkai Savath, a smaller world, primarily hosting a logistical and materiel installation, reported that during the securing of the installation's outer perimeter, they had encountered a group of Volkai civilians who had not been evacuated according to our pre-action notification protocol. 11 civilians, sheltering in a maintenance structure adjacent to the installation. The division's ground commander, Colonel Ashatren, handled the situation correctly. The civilians were identified, assessed as non-combatants, provided with emergency rations and basic medical assessment, and relocated to a position well clear of the installation before the division's work continued. Colonel Tren filed a full incident report, which is in the classified appendix. I tell this story because I think it matters what we did when we found 11 people who were not our targets. We moved them. We fed them. We left them clear of the work. I'm not describing this for commendation. It is the standard we set, and the standard was met. But because the record of 19 days should include both what we destroyed and what we did not, and the two things together constitute the complete truth of the operation in a way that either one alone does not. The third moment is the one I want to describe in the most detail, because it is the one that has attracted the most scrutiny, and the one I think about most often, alone, in the hours when testimony is not required of me. Day 19. The final sanctuary world, Volkai Prime, the Ascendancy's homeworld, the seat of the Theological Council, the origin point of the doctrine that had classified our dead as unformed. My action group reached orbit at 600 hours. The orbital defense platforms had been addressed by a forward element the previous day. The space above Volkai Prime was quiet in the way that spaces become quiet after everything that was in them has been removed. The Theological Council had not evacuated. I learned this from the ground reconnaissance element we dropped at 700 hours. The Council hierarchs, 17 of them, in full theological regalia, seated in the hall of the shaping voice at the center of the primary sanctuary complex, had chosen to remain. They had sent a transmission before the reconnaissance element landed, addressed again to the carrier of the unformed wrath, stating that they would not flee the voice's own house, that they placed themselves in the hands of the shaping voice, and that they called upon the shaping voice to witness what the unformed intended to do. I had my shuttle prepped at 7:30. My flag captain, Dorsey Mail, asked me not to go down. He said it was unnecessary, that the ground element could certify the hall and the hierarchs without the fleet admiral's presence, that there was nothing in the operational orders that required me to set foot on Volkai Prime personally. He was right on all 3 counts. I went anyway. When Mail asked me why, standing there in the shuttle bay while the crew was running pre-launch checks around us, I found that it took me a moment to find the answer in terms that were fully honest rather than just professionally adequate. The professional answer would have been that senior officers should be present for the final verification of a major operation. That answer is not untrue. It is also not the whole thing. The whole thing is this. I had read the names. I had carried the names for 3 months. I had ordered 409 of my own people into a battle that killed them. I had spoken the words, "There will be no further communication on this channel," and meant them. And the Ardent Spire had gone on for 10 more days because I had meant them. And now it was day 19 and the last sanctuary world was below me, and I did not want the final moment of the operation to happen at a remove. I did not want to be on a bridge when the work was finished. I wanted to stand on the ground of the place where the doctrine was made, and I wanted the people who made it to see me standing there, and I wanted them to understand, not through a transmission or a record or a subsequent account, but through the simple physical fact of a person in a room, what they had created and what it had become. I told Mail, "I need to go down." He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Yes, sir," and stepped back, and I boarded the shuttle. The day on Volkai Prime was clear. I remember being struck by that, struck in the precise way that you are struck by something that contains an irony so large it has become almost too heavy to hold. The sky above the hall of the shaping voice was a deep, pale amber, the color that the atmospheric particulates of Volkai Prime lend to the upper air, and the sun, their sun, the star they had prayed to their deity beneath for however many thousands of years their civilization had existed, was overhead and bright. It was a beautiful day. I will not pretend it wasn't. My security detachment and I crossed the open ground between the landing zone and the hall's main entrance on foot. The sanctuary complex was enormous by any measure, a sprawling arrangement of interlocked structures in a pale stone that caught the amber light and gave it back warm. There were gardens, carefully maintained, elaborate, the kind of gardens that require generations of attention to reach their current state. The Volkai who tended those gardens had presumably been doing so that morning, before the reconnaissance element landed, and had subsequently cleared the complex per our standing procedure for civilian protection. The gardens were empty. The flowers in them, or what passes for flowers on Volkai Prime, ground-level growth in deep purples and an off-white that read almost silver in the direct sun, were still open, still facing the light. I noted the gardens. I noted them specifically because I wanted to remember that the Volkai were not a civilization without beauty. They had built beautiful things. They maintained beautiful things. They had also filed a doctrinal brief stating that 41 million people did not deserve to breathe, and they had backed that brief with 6 weeks of atmospheric poisoning across 14 worlds, and the beauty of the gardens did not change what the brief said or what the drones had done. Beauty does not function as an offset. I had learned that before I ever put on a uniform, from a grandmother who survived something on a different scale in a different century, and who told me once, with a precision I have never forgotten, that the people who did the worst things in human history often kept very tidy houses. It is worth remembering when you are standing in a beautiful garden about to do what has to be done. The Hall of the Shaping Voice was exactly what the reconnaissance element's description had prepared me for, and still somehow larger. The interior was open to a vaulted ceiling that must have been 60 meters above the floor, the stone carved into interlocking patterns that caught and diffused the light coming through high amber glass panels along both walls. The floor was a pale, smooth material, not quite stone, something with a slight give that suggested it was designed for long hours of standing at prayer, and the hall ran perhaps 200 meters from the entrance to the far wall, where a raised dais held a structure I can only describe as an altar, though I do not know enough about Volokite theology to know if that is accurate. The 17 hierarchs were seated in a semicircle on the dais. They had arranged themselves in full ceremonial dress, layered robes in the ascendancy's principal colors, which are a deep crimson and a pale gold, and headdresses of considerable elaborateness. They had lit before their seats small offerings of some kind, a pale smoke rising from 17 identical points in a row before them, very slow in the still air of the hall. They were praying, quietly, in what I took to be unison, though the acoustics of the hall made it difficult to determine whether the sound was one voice or 17. They did not stop when I entered. I walked the length of the hall. My security detachment stayed at the entrance. I had told them to. This was mine to do, not theirs. My boots on that floor were the only sound I made, and my sound was the only addition to the sound of 17 voices praying. I stopped 3 meters from the dais. The hierarch at the center of the semicircle, the first voice, the theological head of the ascendancy, an old being in the way that the Volokite are old, which involves a quality of stillness that the youngest of them do not have, opened its eyes and looked at me. It did not stop praying. It finished the phrase it was in the middle of, and then it stopped, and the others stopped when it stopped. The first voice addressed me in the Volokite liturgical tongue, which I do not speak. My translator rendered it with a half-second delay. You have come to do what the unformed do. We had hoped the shaping voice might turn your hand. I said the shaping voice did not turn the drones. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and in that silence the pale smoke rose from its 17 points, and the amber light came through the high panels, and the hall held us all in it. 17 hierarchs in crimson and gold, and one human in a field jacket who had come from very far away for very specific reasons. And I think that silence was the truest moment of the 19 days, more than any transmission, more than any order given or refused. The first voice looked at me for a long time. I do not know what it was looking for or whether it found anything. Then it said, "Will you tell us the names of your dead?" I had expected many things in that hall. I had modeled the conversation in my mind during the shuttle descent, turning over what I would say to anger, to defiance, to an offer of theological terms. I had not expected that. I reached into the front pocket of my field jacket. I had been carrying, since the morning we left Tyranny's Deep, a folded card, not the 43-page document I had given the fleet officers, but a smaller distillation, the 14 worlds by name and the count under each name. I carry the fold card everywhere. I have carried it since an aide in the Office of Colonial Affairs handed it to me across a desk and said, quietly, that these were the numbers as of the last verification, and I had taken it and folded it and put it in my pocket and not put it anywhere else. I unfolded it. I read them the 14 names. I read the count under each name. It took approximately 4 minutes. I read slowly, because I thought each name deserved the time a name deserves, and because I wanted the words to reach the ceiling of that hall and fill it the way their prayers filled it, and because I thought that in some accounting that does not fit inside any framework I have been given, the 41 million deserved to be spoken aloud in the place where the decision about them was made, by the person who had come the farthest to answer that decision. None of the hierarchs spoke. None of them prayed. They listened. I will say this for them: they listened without looking away. I do not know what that means in terms of what they felt or understood. I know what it looked like, and it looked like people receiving something they could not put down afterward. When I finished reading, I folded the card back and held it for a moment. Then I set it down on the floor of the hall at the base of the dais, in the clear space between my boots and the first step of the platform. I set it down carefully, so it lay flat, so it would be there after I left. The first voice looked at the card on the floor, then it looked at me. It said, "What do you want of us?" I said, "Nothing, the work is done." I turned and walked back down the length of the hall. I did not look back. My security detachment fell in behind me when I cleared the entrance, and we walked back across the open ground to the shuttle in the amber sunlight, and I gave the order to the fleet to begin withdrawal procedures, and that was the end of the 19th day. I am aware that this account, specifically the scene in the hall, has been used in some corners of commentary to suggest that my actions in that room constituted a form of clemency, that by walking away, by leaving the hierarchs alive, I had demonstrated restraint that complicates the characterization of the overall operation. I want to address that reading directly. The hierarchs of the Volcae ascendancy are alive because they were not military or infrastructural targets. That is the entire reason. The operation was authorized to address military and infrastructural assets. The Theological Council, in the narrow legal sense, administers doctrine and ceremony. They do not command warships. I am a careful reader of my orders. I addressed what I was authorized to address. But I also want to say something that is not in the operational record, because I think the truth of it is important and because I am tired of leaving it out. When I set that card on the floor of the hall, I was not offering them mercy. I was not demonstrating the nobility of Terran values or the magnanimity of a civilization that could stop. I was doing something much simpler and, I think, much more permanent. I was making sure they understood. I was making sure that the last thing the Theological Council of the Volcae Ascendancy heard, in the hall of the Shaping Voice, surrounded by the smoke of their offerings and the amber light of their cathedral, was the names, our names, the names of the unformed who do not breathe sacred air. I wanted them to carry those names. I wanted the survivors of the ascendancy, civilian, theological, whatever fraction of their civilization persists through whatever comes next, to live inside the knowledge of what those names cost, not as an abstraction, as a weight, as the thing that is in the room when they pray and still there when they finish. That is not mercy. I do not know what to call it. I have not found a word for it in any language I speak. It sits outside the categories of the testimonies I have given, outside proportionality frameworks and interspecies conflict doctrine and the legal architecture of the compact, and I think it sits there correctly. Some things are too specific to fit inside general categories, and what happened to those 14 worlds was specific, and what I did in that hall was specific, and I think the universe is, in the end, less organized than our frameworks prefer. I will close this testimony with the thing I said to Fleet Captain Mail when I returned to the irrevocable promise at the end of day 19. He met me at the shuttle bay. He asked how it had gone on the ground. I told him it had gone according to plan. He asked, after a moment, whether I thought what we had done was the right thing. It was a question he had earned the right to ask, because he had been with the fleet for all 19 days, and because he had lost people he knew in the Pelath engagement, and because He was asking in the way that people ask when they need to say the question aloud in order to be able to go on carrying it. I told him that right and wrong were frameworks designed for situations where other options existed. I told him that 41 million people had been asked, across 6 weeks, to die breathing, without the option to choose something different, without anyone asking for their preference, without the universe extending to them the courtesy of a choice. I told him that we had been in a position to make a choice, and we had made it, and I did not know if that made it right in any framework he or I could name, but that I was not going to stand in front of those 41 million names and call it wrong either. He thought about that for a moment, then he said, "That'll do, Admiral." I thought and still think that it would. Before the Ardent Spire departed Tyranny's Deep, I was briefed by the Joint Council's Strategic Intelligence Team on the Compact's assessment of the lesson-learning curves of the 14 or so species in the outer territories that the Council considered potentially aspirational species, watching the Compact's handling of the Volkai brief and drawing conclusions. The briefer was a careful, meticulous analyst named Safi Karen, who had spent 12 years studying the decision-making patterns of developing interstellar civilizations. She told me, without editorializing, that the current pattern of compact responses to interspecies violence, formal protests, tabled petitions, 90-day committee convening windows, was being interpreted by the aspirational species as a signal that the compact would absorb a significant degree of offense before producing a consequential response. She told me she had been flagging this in her quarterly assessments for 3 years. She also told me that the pattern could be updated, that patterns once broken, recalibrated. That what happens once becomes, in the minds of the civilizations watching, the thing that could happen again. I thought about analyst Karen often over the 19 days. I thought about her on day 19, standing in the amber light outside the hall of the Shaping Voice before I went in. I thought about what it would mean, not just to the Volkai, but to every civilization that had been watching the Compact's 90-day committees and drawing its conclusions, to see 380 ships go all the way, to see the Ardent Spire not stop at the outer boundary, not accept the theological invocations on the frequency, not treat the offer of negotiation from a bunker on Pelath as an outcome that resolved the situation, to see it go, instead, all 19 days to the homeworld, to the hall. I hope they saw it. I hope every civilization in watching range of the Volkai Ascendancy's territory saw every day of those 19 days and drew the correct conclusion from the seeing of it. The correct conclusion is not that Terran civilization is pitiless. We are not pitiless. I read every name on that 43-page document. I gave the order to protect Volkai civilians. I walked into the hall and I read the names aloud to the people who had named our dead unformed, and I left the card on the floor so they would have something physical to hold when the weight of it came for them later. The correct conclusion is that we are specific. That when something specific is done to us, we produce a specific answer, and we take that answer all the way to the end of it, without committee review and without a 90-day convening window, and we leave the record on the floor where it can be seen. The 14 worlds are gone. The people who lived on them are not recoverable. I can do nothing for them except this: make sure the universe that let them die knows the cost of letting it happen again. Not because the universe will feel that cost as grief. The universe does not grieve. But because the civilizations inside the universe make calculations, and calculations can be updated. And what we update them to is our only remaining gift to the 41,207,914 people who died breathing the air that someone else had decided they did not deserve. My name is Corin Veth. I commanded the Ardent Spire. I have given this testimony 5 times now. I will give it as many more times as I am asked to give it, in as many rooms as they choose to put me in, with or without working recording devices. That is all I have to say.